Today we're going to talk about value scale for tonal shading, which is actually an introduction to shading and you need to practice it well to master it. If you're unfamiliar with the grayscale value exercises, it's basically a value study going from light to dark. You can simply draw out several rectangles and then separate it to a few equal sections. It's like getting to know your pencil's characteristics and see if you can talk to it with its own language. So what I mean is each pencil has a different grade and a different range of values that gives you a range of grays to draw with. We can actually think of it as another warm-up exercise for artists, but it's really much more than that. This is something especially for professionals, and that's why I'm saying this is something for all levels. For the first one, I numbered my sections from 1 to 3, and 1 is going to be the darkest, and 3 is going to be the lightest. You can draw it in a larger size, but I suggest not to make it smaller than this because I think this is the minimum size. I start shading from the square number 1. In drawing, I think the best method is to start shading from the darkest parts of the drawing. That's actually because we can get the darkest parts of the pencil and control the brightest values. As you can see, the tip of my pencil is quite sharp, and it doesn't matter if you sharpen it with a cutter or a pencil sharpener, but keep it sharp, it really makes your life easier. So I shade with the sharpness of the tip of my pencil, and I try to keep rotating the pencil in my hand so that I can make good use of all the sharp angles. I try not to apply my shadows with back and forth movements, and I actually shade from one direction. Now I'm dragging the pencil on the paper from top to the bottom, and I don't repeat the same movement from bottom to the top. Because if you take a close look at the paper under a microscope, there are some ridges and depressions that are actually the texture of the paper. And when you shade in one direction and feel it, and then you shade in the opposite direction, you might destroy the texture of the paper. And they say the texture of the paper is crushed, which reduces the beauty of your work and your drawing. But before we proceed, let me show you some tips to improve your strokes. When shading, the beginning and end of your strokes should not be bold. Because let's suppose you shaded an area and you want to shade the area next to it. There should not be a distinct border in the middle, and shadows must be uniform and totally blended. If the beginning and end of your strokes get bold, like in this example, when you shade the area next to it again, and the part where the shadows overlap, more darkness will be created, and it might appear inconsistent and messy. So don't draw your strokes like this, or like bold dark lines with long spacing. So draw smooth and uniform lines so that the beginning and end of the line are not bold and your entire stroke is uniform. You can shade in a slant or vertical directions if you want the area to be darker, but as I said, we don't have back and forth movements. You can practice drawing these strokes on a piece of paper before practicing grayscale values, and then you can shade the squares. Sometimes you draw the lines vertically, horizontally, or obliquely, but whatever direction you go, do not go back. This is the point you should pay attention to. So darken the first square as much as your pencil allows. But this darkness does not happen with too much hand pressure. The best thing to do is to shade in layers with one single pencil. Do not use a lighter pencil to fill in the lighter squares. This is actually cheating. The general goal of this exercise is to familiarize yourself with the gray range that your pencil gives you and provides. So choose your pencil from the beginning of the practice and go along with that one single pencil. I recommend you to pick a 4B or 3B pencil for this exercise. These are the best pencils for this practice. Because if you want to try other mediums in future, such as pen, you probably know that the pen mostly doesn't have higher grades. Likewise, a monochrome colored pencil. So you should be able to control the degree of darkness and lightness by controlling the pressure and movements of your hand. And that's the whole purpose. And it doesn't matter what kind of medium you choose. If you want to make it darker than this, you can take a higher grade for the pencil. So for real drawings, to add more darkness, avoid putting too much pressure on the pencil and use a darker pencil instead. I'm shading here with a 4B graphite pencil. And this pencil really doesn't give me more darkness than that. So if you try to make it darker, you might damage the texture of the paper, and that's why sometimes the graphite looks shiny on your paper. For square number 2, I start shading with the same sharpness of the pencil. The value of the middle square should be an average degree of darkness. So what does it exactly mean? Square number 1 is the darkest value that my pencil can provide. Square number 3 is the white of my paper. I want to go from this darkness to this lightness, and I only have one empty part in the middle. So let's shade this square in the middle and make it darker layer by layer with a pencil. Take your time with this and don't rush. I spent enough time to fill each of these squares. So this one's completed. The next chart includes 5 separate sections. Darken the first square exactly according to number 1 above. I almost skipped this part of the video because it was repetitive. Then I will shade number 3 according to this average value on the chart above. And as you can see, I skipped one square in between each of these two. The square number 2 should be something between number 1 and 3. Again, I'm gonna find the average value between these two range of grays, and I shade it and make it darker layer by layer as I said. As you can see, I created some of my strokes horizontally and now making vertical strokes. So do not forget to preserve the texture of the paper. Each value of gray represents a value of color. So each color has a gray version in a black and white world. So each square should be uniform and represent one specific color. You don't need to define the border between each of these two squares with a bold line. The difference in hue between two squares make the borders recognizable for us. Square number 4 is the middle value between number 3 and 5. A little bit lighter than the number 3 and darker than the white paper. I like to use the sharpness of my pencil for darker squares because the sharper tip penetrates more holes and cavity on the paper's texture, and it easily gives me a darker value. But for the squares that represent lighter values and shading them is difficult and a bit more tricky, I prefer to use the softer parts of my pencil's tip to have better control over the paper. This part is a little more challenging than the other parts. But that's what we want. We want to challenge ourselves more in each stage. your strokes might seem a little scratchy and less uniform. And that's why I'm using softer edges. So to avoid this, try not to press your pencil too much. And try to create a completely uniform layer of graphite. Don't blend anything with any blending tool like paper, blending stump, and do not use your fingers. The main trick here is to be able to repeat the same value of gray all over the square. When shading, be careful not to drag your strokes on the side squares, because you might make them darker and change their color value. We don't want this to happen. We want every square to be preserved and remain uniform. The next chart has 9 distinct parts. In this one, I want to add another square between every 2 squares on the previous chart above. As usual, shade the first one as dark as it gets according to your pencil's grade. And exactly like number 1 above. Skip the number 2 and shade the number 3 according to the second square above. Skip this one again and shade the next one according to this middle one above. And again, skip another one and shade the next one exactly like this one in here. Another space and leave the white paper for the last. Again, for each one of these empty squares, consider a middle value between the 2 squares next to it. Brighter than the previous square, darker than the next one. And so we have to shade it something between them. Again, pay attention to have a consistent layer all over your square for each one of them. After shading the square number 2, I'll jump onto the number 4. The value of this one should be something between 3 and 5. Softness of shading is very important, so put a smooth layer of graphite. The way you hold your pencil and the pressure that you apply to each stroke is very important in this exercise. So I continue this process the same way and consider each one of these empty squares as the middle value between the squares before and after it. If needed, there's no problem to go back and adjust the previous squares. This practice was for you to help you to separate these values step by step. At the end, draw a chart with 12 parts. This time, we don't skip any of the squares and leave empty spaces in between. So let's start with the square number 1 and fill the next parts in order. And try to shade each different part 1 degree lighter than the previous one. The further I go, I reduce the pressure of my hand a little, and at the same time, I shade the lighter values using less layers. This is really important to know. For example, let's say if I use 10 layers for the first few squares, I use 3 or 2 layers for the last squares so that it won't make them too dark. I went back and darkened some of my squares and adjust them a little so that I could push this up to 12. Wherever there are darker spots and blemishes, I take a piece of kneaded eraser, sharpen the tip so that I can easily lift some of the graphite off the paper. Do it very slowly and nicely. If you press the eraser too much, it may create white spots on the shadow of your work, which will make it inconsistent. After all of this, we need to create another chart without separating it into several squares. This one is a little bit different. It means we start from the darkest value, and without shading step by step, we shade consistently to the lightest value. This is the most important exercise that you should do after finishing the charts. It is really better to repeat this last exercise several more times. Make sure that there are no distinct border inside this table and the shadows and values are completely blended. Shade it in such a way that it is impossible to separate them and define any border as if it is a single uniform shape just getting closer to the light. Creating an even shading from light to dark is going to prepare us to have a consistent pressure while we're drawing. The way you hold your pencil and the pressure that you apply to each stroke is very important in this exercise. And there are a few things that you should aim for. You want to make sure that all the sections are all different and no values repeat. Think of creating a smooth gradient that going from dark to light. And holding your pencil a bit further will help you gain more control into the amount of pressure that actually put onto your pencil. Once we hold the pencil from afar and use the side of it to shade, we're able to go from dark to light. Getting comfortable with holding your pencil this way may take a little bit of time, but it's the correct way to shade. Now, if I were to hold my pencil much closer, it would create more streakiness. So I definitely recommend you guys try this if you haven't already. And even if you have, it's always a great tip to try. Every time you're shading, think about creating a smooth, consistent gradient while making all value different going from dark to light. I love practicing these and I think it's a great way to train your hand to shade. And overall, what you should strike for is shading in one direction. Keep the pressure consistent with every section. And make sure that all of your values are different. And try another pencil or another medium. This way you can feel the different pressure and consistency of each pencil or each medium. Thank you guys for watching. This is Peony here and I'll see you soon in the next tutorial.